Greetings and salutations. Welcome to Autist Circle Season 2, Episode 7. Jacques-Louis David. I am your host, the Bleach Demon, and joined as always by Total Blackout Painting, also known as Fat Dave. So, this should be an interesting one.
Yeah, this is gonna be a pretty information heavy episode. Um, this guy was he was a fascinating artist, and he was a really incredible um, incredible fucking like just person in history. Um,
hmm
Lived through a lot of really amazing things and did a lot of amazing things. Really involved with the French Revolution. And anyhow, we'll go on to that. But first off, let's just jump right into the presentation. So first thing here is got some notes on what neoclassicism is. So this is the Pastoral Paulo from 1824, and I forgot to write down the artist's name, but he's a neoclassicist artist from France as well. So neoclassicism, Europeans of the 18th century, Age of Enlightenment, wanted their work in architecture to mirror and carry the same set of standards as the idealized works of the Greeks and Romans. In 1708, the Herculaneum was rediscovered, and excavations on Pompeii began in 1748. And
Oh,
neoclassicism as an art movement began in Italy, in Rome, as the art historian Johann Joachim Winkelmann, as his book Thoughts on Imitation of Greek Works in Painting and Scripture, published in 1750, played a leading role in establishing the aesthetic theory of neoclassicism. And he was really the first to articulate the difference between Greek, Greco Roman, and Roman art. He was known as the prophet and founding hero of modern archaeology.
oh,
However, the Italian art historian Giovanni Pietro Beori was also a forerunner. In 1664, his lecture at the Accademia di San Luca advocated for a return to classical ideals in art and greatly influenced the movement as well. So, neoclassicism arose as artists and architects infused their work with past Greco Roman ideals. A return to the study of science and history, mathematics, and anatomical correctness abounded, replacing the Rococo vanity culture and the court painting climate that preceded it. So, with that blurb out of the way, we're going to jump to the timeline here. And we see that David was born in the same year that Pompeii was rediscovered, in the late Rococo period. Of course, his life intersects the French Revolution and the coronation of Napoleon, and he was really the one of the premier neoclassicist artists. So let me read my thing here. Um, David sits at a major turning point in art history. He bridges late Rococo and full neoclassicism. He's the artist who carries neoclassicism directly into the age of the French Revolution and Napoleon. If Fragonard, who we talked about last week, represents the elegant, playful, aristocratic world of the aristocracy, uh, David really represents the hard reset and the moral seriousness, antique models, public virtue, and political image making that was part and parcel of the French Revolution. The Met identifies David as embodying neoclassicism, while Britannica calls him the most influential French neoclassicist. He was born in 1748, in the later Rococo, like I said, but his mature reputation comes from the 1780s and 1790s, when neoclassicism became the dominant art movement in France. His career then extends into the Napoleonic period, when that same classical language is repurposed for imperial grandeur. The Met's Hilleburn timeline notes that under Napoleon, the neoclassical style was effectively embodied by David, even as the seeds of romanticism were beginning to grow around him.
Hmm.
So, jump over to the man here, and we mentioned him last week in our presentation with Fragonard because he intersected with them. So this is
Mhm.
Jacques-Louis David. He was born in 1748 in Paris to Louise Maurice David, a prosperous parent merchant, and Marie Genevieve Bouron. In 1757, his father passes as a result of the duel, and the sources or the reason for the duel have really been lost to time. Nobody knows. They just know he died in a duel. And this
I
left.
mean, let's address that for a second. When you were able to, I don't know, be a man about it and take your frustrations out, or get your ass handed to you. Right? It's a win-win.
Yeah. It usually ended in death for somebody because that's just how they were. They were fighting with swords. Um, and you'll notice in the picture we have here that David has a lump on his face. So he had a tumor on his face, and it affected his speech throughout his life. It's speculated that he got it, that it's a granuloma that was the result of a sword accident when he was younger, although that's not fully confirmed.
Huh.
So after his father died, he was left to be raised by his extended family, particularly his uncles, Francois Buron, and his mother's brother, and who was an architect at the et Forêts, and Jacques-Francois de Maisons, who his mother's brother-in-law and was also an architect. And his uncles were not especially tender with him. He was raised in an austere environment where his childhood was marked by loss. He had a facial tumor, like I said, that impeded his speech. His family wanted him to be an architect, obviously, because he was raised by two fucking architect uncles. But he always desired to be a painter. They provided him with a solid classical education, and he studied classical literature and drawing. And then he first started learning painting from Francois Boucher, who we talked about last week because he was also instrumental in Fragonard's upbringing. But Boucher is ostensibly a distant relative of David, and he actually placed Boucher in the studio of Joseph Marie Vienne, who was the last holder of the Premier du Roi, which is the first painter to the king, obviously because they fucking executed the king after this. Before the bishop, the position was abolished during the revolution. And contrary to other artists, his artistic pursuits were not aimed towards the commercial path. His art training was directed at serious academic art. And at the age of 18, he was enrolled in the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in Paris, which gave his artistic life a clear path, not the decorative Rococo style or frescoes, but towards historical paintings. So this is a painting of young David as a youth by Jean-Marie Vienne. So at the academy, his life wasn't any easier. The school was the gatekeeper for the competitive art world of 18th century France. And his ambition was aimed at the Prix de Rome, just like Fragonard. And this was, again, the state scholarship. And he failed 3 times to win. The first time with the Minerva fighting Mars. And then his next attempt was Diana and Apollo killing Niobe's children. And then his third one was the death of Seneca before he finally won in 1774 with Aristratus discovering the cause of Antiochus's disease. Oh no, yeah, that's right. And in 1775, he traveled to Italy after winning. He traveled to Italy with his mentor, Vien, who had just been appointed as the director of the French Academy in Rome. And while in Rome, like every other visiting artist, he studied the great Baroque masters. And this is our gratuitous Caravaggio insert. This is Martha and Mary Magdalene from 1598. And it really is amazing looking at this painting. Just every time I go back to Caravaggio's paintings, I'm just like, man, he was so ahead of his time in terms of how the realism and how great he made things look.
I'm just impressed with you've got basically the light source on the mirror.
Yeah,
Which, if you've gone to any of those old studios, they've got the skylight there to illuminate the subject. That's such a cool thing to see included.
yeah, yeah. Um, and it's funny because we used to have like this domed mirror when I was a kid. We had one of those dome mirror. Turns out it was a polished tank hubcap. So every time I see one of these, I just think of that. But he also he also studied high Renaissance masters, and this is the Deposition by Raphael in 1507. But during this time, he was also introduced to Raphael Mengs, who was a Danish artist who disliked Rococo's tendency to make ancient subjects seem frivolous. And Mengs was the one who introduced him to the writings of Wickman. And this is a painting of Wickman done by Mengs, or Winckelmann, sorry. And they were incredibly influential on his style. So in 1779, as part of the Prix, he was able to tour the newly excavated ruins in Pompeii. And this just deepened his desire to embrace the classical styles and paint classical works. And he remained in Italy until 1780. So, upon returning to Paris, this is his painting Belisarius begging for alms in 1781. Upon returning to Paris in July of 1780, David was he had a finely honed visual seriousness and a much clearer sense of vocation. Rome gave him talents and Paris gave him the stage. His fellow students found him difficult, but his talent was undeniable. And when he returned to Paris via influential connections, he was made an official member of the Royal Academy, although not every member was entirely thrilled about it because he kind of backdoored his way in. He submitted Belisarius begging for alms to the Salon of the Paris Salon in 1781. The exhibition of which was a high honor. After the Salon, the King Louis XV granted him lodging in the Louvre, which was a really prestigious thing at the time. So while he was in the Louvre, he became acquainted with Charles Pierre Picot, who was a wealthy building contractor and the superintendent of construction at the Louvre. And he was kind of like the caretaker of a lot of royal properties. And then he actually asked David to marry his daughter, Marguerite Charlotte. And he had four children. They had 4 children, and this was his painting of her. And this was done in like 1802 or something like that. So they had 4 children. They had Charles Louis Jules David, born in 1783, and then Francois Eugene David, born in 1784, and then he had twins, Laura Emile Félicité David and Pauline Jean David, both born in 1786. So
one would hope the twins.
Yeah. That'd be really funny if they weren't. So the marriage, it brought him money and status, and his position at the academy really brought him pupils and status. So he was a really prominent artist at the time. And after being commissioned to paint a piece by the government, he decided only in Rome can I paint Romans. And he borrowed money from his father to go back to Rome.
His father-in-law, I'd presume, since
His father-in-law,
biological
his
father
father.
died.
Yeah,
Okay.
his father-in-law. Sorry, yeah. He got money from his wife's dad for it, and so this is where the first painting comes in, and this is the Oath of the Herati. And Kingdom of Vinland mentioned in the chat earlier that the Roman salute has no historical basis, but this painting clearly displays it, and so the myth making portion really makes a lot of sense, and that's a great input. I really appreciate you saying that, Vinland. So this was painted in 1784 to 1785 in Rome as the Royal Commission from Louis XV, and it's gouache and oil on canvas, and it's fucking huge. It's 10.8 feet by 13.9 feet, or 330 centimeters by 425 centimeters. It's a huge painting. And this was first shown at the Paris Salon in 1785. And the thing that's
Wow.
fascinating to me about that is that he painted it in Rome and then transported it to Paris. That must have been, because even if it's rolled up, right? Like even if they take it off the frame and roll it up, it's still a
That's still
huge piece to move.
13. Yeah. At
So
13.9 feet plus packing, even if it's rolled, or if you go the other way, it's still 11 feet.
yeah, yeah,
That
it's
is
huge.
fascinating.
Yeah. So the subject, of course, is a Roman legend from the 7th century, the Herati and the Curiati. Rome and Alba Longa were going to war, but they didn't want to send armies. Instead, they sent three brothers from two prominent families, the Herati from Rome and the Curiati from Alba. And this image depicts the three Herati brothers pledging fidelity before their father with the swords before he hands them over. And it captures their oath of duty, submission, and self-sacrifice, because they know they could very well die, right? They're going out to sacrifice themselves for Rome.
Hmm.
And you see in the lower left hand or right hand corner, the woman crying is her sister Camilla, and she's betrothed to a Curiati brother. So she knows that no matter the outcome, she's going to lose a loved one. And so
Hmm.
the story goes that they get down to the first thing is the two Herati brothers die early in the fight, and then the third Herati brother actually comes back and uh, kills the other three. He kills the Curiati, winning the battle for Rome. So
Hmm.
this is and then this when the brother comes home, of course his sister is crying over not only her lost brother but her lost fiance. And so he kills his sister because she's crying over the enemy. Um which is pretty
I
brutal,
mean, that's
but
the
yeah.
most Roman thing ever, but yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty Roman for sure. And this is one of the most iconic neoclassicist works, and eschewing the Rococo softness, using stark realism more that's more similar to a Baroque style than the the frivolous softness of the Rococo, and it's far more realistic than a lot of the Renaissance paintings, even though there is a bit of stylization or idealized styling in here.
Hmm.
So, the painting itself, it really highlighted the changing tastes in France at the time, um, shifting from soft aristocratic frivolity to public discipline, which really preceded the revolution. And the image is seen as somewhat prophetic of the revolution, where people are going to um, eschew the frivolity and become a more serious state-minded people.
Hmm.
So After the oath, after the oath of Hirati was displayed, um, it elevated David's status from just an artist to one of the most important artists of the pre-revolutionary French Enlightenment. The image ostensibly symbolized many values of Rousseau's social contract, which would become important during the revolution. It also highlighted Rousseau's notion of separate spheres, which dictated a clear division of male and female attitudes between duty and society, which we'll also see
Hmm.
displayed in a later painting. So this students began flocking to David after this. He became one of the most important trainers in France for the next generation of painters. And he continued to refine his classical style, um, although his works began to help solidify the adoption of the Roman Republican values of civic virtue and self-sacrifice and duty to the state. And along those lines, we'll jump to the next painting here, which is the death of Socrates. This was painted in 1787. It's oil on canvas, and it's currently at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And it's not as big as the other ones, but it is not small. Well, I guess it's small in comparison, but it's 51 inches by 77 inches, or 130 by 196 centimeters. And this was commissioned by Charles Louis David of Montigny, um, a wealthy connoisseur uh, in the Parisian Parliament. And of course, it depicts the death of Socrates, and this is one of his most iconic paintings. Um, I think most people have seen this in some way, that or have seen this painting without knowing who it is. We've seen this depiction of Socrates' death being handed the hemlock so many different ways.
Hmm.
Um, and so Socrates was made to drink hemlock tea, and while the cup is being handed to him, still he's still depicted as teaching. So his hand is pointing upwards, indicating that he's speaking about the immortality of the soul. And while accepting the cup, um, and of course, this is the death of Socrates in 399, moments before he's executed for corrupting the youth of Athens. So
Hmm.
there's some interesting stylistic choices here. Go ahead.
No, I'm just really weirdly focused on one of the figures in the background, just waving at the viewer
Yeah,
as
the dude
they're
in
up going up the stairs. It's like, wait, what?
yeah, the guy waving in the background. Now, that's an interesting detail, especially given that the painting isn't gigantic, but he's really well done in the background, which I think puts a fine point on David's talent. Um, and again, the lighting in this is pretty simple, but it's done very well. And he's depicted as he's surrounded by grief. Um, an aging Plato is depicted at the foot of the bed, although Plato was not actually he was not actually present at the execution in real life, but he put him
Mhm.
here. So originally David had wanted to paint this in 1782, but he didn't really paint it until he was paid to do so, which makes sense. I
Yeah.
I wouldn't do shit like that either if I didn't have to. Um, so while the oath is about civic duty, this image is about intellectual conviction and fidelity to truth, even under the burden of unjust authority. Um, the execution of Socrates is not just it's not just an image of death, but it's transformed into a manifesto of principle. Surrounded by grief, Socrates remains calm and rational and committed to the truth. So I like to think of Socrates as one of the original autists. Um,
Yeah, yeah, that's a fair assessment of the man.
because he was unassailable in his search for truth, um, and his convictions were unshaking, which really I think is symbolized by this painting where he is he's stoically accepting his fate and telling the people around him, basically like the soul is immortal. I'm going to heaven or something, he's pointing up. He's indicating like this is not the end for me. Even though everybody around him he's surrounded by grief. He is rational and um kind of consoling until the very end.
And he's one of the most famous promulgators of my favorite way of looking at the world is, yeah, I know I'm an idiot, or more closely to his, yeah, I know that I know nothing,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
that
pretty
is such a
much.
liberating moment where it's like, I don't know jack shit, so I can learn. This is cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Um yeah, he was passionate about learning and teaching, and again, unshaken in his ideals. So that brings us to the revolution, and I have a picture of Napoleon here, although he didn't come up until much later. So his next big painting was the lictors bringing the body of to Brutus, bring to Brutus the bodies of his sons, and this, of course, depicts Brutus over here stoically in the corner, while his wife is inconsolable as the bodies of his sons are being brought in. And this was done in 1789. And this was meant to be displayed in the salon. However, before the opening of the salon, the revolution kicked off, and the National Assembly had been established, and the Bastille had fallen. So David's work helped to establish the visual and moral atmosphere of the revolution. His prior works had rejected the decadence of the Rococo in exchange for the severity of Roman stoicism and self-sacrifice. And once the revolution in full swing, he ceased being merely an artist and became an active participant in revolutionary politics. He was a supporter and friend of Maximilien Robespierre, um, which this makes him look like he has a really weird head.
Yeah,
Which didn't stay on his shoulders all
that,
that long. Um,
no, no. Although it stayed on far too long for the terror.
yeah, yeah, and he was one of the most influential members of the revolution and a member of the Jacobin Club, which continues to suck until this day. Um, and it was one of the most influential political clubs at the time. While people like Fragonard fled the city and the country, David remained to help rebuild it with the Republican values of the revolution. And those who knew him maintained that his generous ardor and high minded idealism and well meaning, though sometimes fanatical enthusiasm, rather than opportunism and jealousy, motivated his activities during this period. So he was a true believer in the revolution. He really wanted what was best for France. He wasn't
Hmm.
just, you know, trying to get what's best for him. So he
Right.
turned his ire on the Royal Academy, likely because of past conflicts, but also because they were royal supporters, obviously. Uh, the Salon eschewed his paintings at the time because they feared that it would inflame public sentiment or support for the revolution. And
Huh.
he was commissioned to paint the oath at the tennis court in 1789 to commemorate the event in which the French Constitution had been established, although the painting was never completed. This is just a drawing he did of it. And the painting was never completed due to political implications. So this is the drawing, the sketch that he made of it, and this depicts the the people of the revolution, or the people of the hell was it? The the National
Yeah.
Assembly, the members of the National
Yeah.
Assembly voting on the French Constitution. So,
Hmm.
in that vein of the revolution, we'll look at probably one of one of the most famous paintings from the revolution, and this is the Death of Marat in 1793. So, yeah, this is oil on canvas, and it measures 65 by 50 and a half inches, or 165 by 20, 128 centimeters. And this is currently at the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Belgium. So the
Hmm.
story is that Jean-Paul Marat was the leader of the Jacobins and one of the most radical figures of the revolution. And he was also a close friend of David.
Hmm.
He was assassinated by Charlotte Corday on July 13th, 1793, while working in his bath. Uh, she gained access to him under the pretense of delivering him a list of people who are marked as enemies of France. And then she took a knife that was hidden in her dress and stabbed him, kill him. So,
I mean, kind of based considering that Marat was just an absolute animal.
yeah. And she was guillotined herself later. Now, the reason why Marat was in the bathtub is because he had a skin disease which made him itch terribly, um, probably from syphilis or something. And his real only relief was in the bath, which had been made into an improvised desk. So he often worked from the bath. David actually organized the funeral for Marat, where he was buried at the Pantheon. So this is often referred to as the Pietà Revolution of the Revolution, and it is one of the most famous works from it. Uh,
Hmm.
the letter in his hand connects the painting to Corday's deception and shows that he was working up to the moment of his death. And the painting makes symbolic ties to kind of Christian martyrdom and political revolution, and it helped kind of beatify Marat's place in history. So he's presented as the victim of assassination, a martyr of the revolution, and it's really politics kind of transformed into a somewhat sacred scene.
Yeah. Just looking, I mean, you can definitely see some of the Caravaggiste influences, both in the background, but also in like, the figure itself.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a departure from the kind of neoclassicist like Roman style, because it's a portrait of a person he knew. He painted them much more familiarly than he did with, you know, the actual Roman scenes.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess some words about Marat is like, yeah, you were saying he was one of he wasn't a liked guy, right? There was a
No,
reason why he
he
was
was
assassinated. Go ahead.
he was the main figure in the Terror, which if you were not the right kind of French revolutionary, you were going to be guillotined, and there's just no way around it.
Yeah,
And while he was also a master of, he was a big proponent of, if I remember right, arts and science, and we're talking like traditional hard sciences. I think he did some early thermodynamic works too, which
yeah,
makes him a fascinating character. Um, but yeah, he was just such a fanatic, and I mean he was his true mistress was Madame Guillotine.
yeah, yeah. And that's an interesting thing too, is that because of that fanaticism, they killed so many fucking people. They executed so many people in France. And I think it was on Saturday, but somebody was saying they executed like almost 2/3 of the population, although I didn't look into that. But they executed so many fucking people, um, just to create that perfect state, right? To keep doing that idealized utopia, as it were, which I think is very similar to the Jacobin movement today, because of course the Jacobins are a heavily socialist club, and socialism is always concerned with a utopia. Socialism wants to make everything perfect. You know, it's like, oh, it wasn't real socialism kind of thing. And in this regard, it's like, well, yeah, it wasn't real liberty. Yeah, once we kill
Yeah.
enough people, we'll have actual freedom. And that doesn't make a lot of sense. But that's really what happened. They just killed a
And
ton of
I
people.
think it's also emblematic of the excesses of most revolutions.
Yeah.
Where it becomes a matter. They go in and they try to purge. They try to purify the mentality of those who are following them. And what was the committee of surveillance? I think it was, with him and several others that headed the terror. And forgive my brain for being foggy on this, but he was like the man who's like, no, just kill them all, just kill them all. They're not living up to the Republican ideal. Let's get rid of them.
Yeah. Which is, I mean, I think that's kind of part and parcel for people who are passionate enough to be revolutionaries. The people who are actually passionate enough to do things are also so ideologically driven that they don't mind chopping a few heads off to get what they want. Again, like I said, we just kill enough people, we'll get our perfect utopia. That's what they were going for. So moving on from there. Oh. So we'll talk a little bit more
I
about
could
the
rant about
revolution
Marat
here.
for a while. So let's keep going.
Well, so this is the an image of the French trying to think what it was. This was their seat of power, basically. So in 1793, David was no longer just the painter of a revolution. He was actually deeply embedded into it. And he and Robespierre and many other Jacobins held high government positions, obviously. And then late July in 1794, the Thermidorian reaction and the subsequent coup caused Robespierre to be jailed and executed the next day. So people did to him what he did to the king, because he was being an asshole. He killed too many fucking people, and so they killed him as a response. But David was not executed. He was imprisoned, first for 4 months in 1794, and then again for 2 months in the subsequent year. And that ended the reign of terror of the Jacobins, and sought to moderate the revolution to bring it back to a more people-centered ideal instead of high-minded nonsense. So while he was in jail, his wife divorced him, but they remarried afterwards. So there's speculation she divorced him to kind of save herself and the children from any sort of persecution, from being associated with him. So
that's fair.
And while he was behind bars and after his release the following year, he campaigned in writing, and more subtly through his art to kind of clear his name in the eyes of the public. Of course, his wife would come and visit him in prison all the time. So again, like I say, they got divorced, but she came and visited him numerous times while they were in prison. And one of those things And this is the painting that really speaks to the separate spheres more than anything. And this is the intervention of the Sabine women, and this was painted in 1799. It's an oil on canvas, and it's another absolutely humongous painting. It's 12 foot 8 inches by 17 feet, or
Hmm.
3.85 by 5.22 meters. And it's currently at the Louvre. So, like, this painting is like bigger than my fucking bedroom.
Yeah.
It's humongous. And of course, it depicts an early Roman legend where the Sabine women, who were abducted by the Romans, they intervened to stop the battle between the Romans, who had become their husbands. They'd, the Romans had abducted them, and then they made them their wives, and then they had children and stuff. And the Sabine men who came really on an unwanted rescue mission. So the central figure is Hercilia, appealing to the Roman Romulus, and the Sabine Titius, who was her father. So
Hmm.
the Sabines are, of course, depicted with the gold shield there. So and this
And very
was
strategically located sword
yeah
sheaths.
yeah very very thankfully very strategically thankfully for the YouTube video, very strategically
Yeah.
located sword sheaths. Um, and this was his attempt to move into the more graceful Greek manner of painting, and really away from the kind of stark Roman style seen in
Hmm.
previous works. And this painting was meant to be an appeal to the masses to calm the violence of the revolution. Of course, when his party wasn't in control of it anymore, he wanted, like, hey, calm down, calm down. Everybody needs to tone it down. Um, and it was really, he was trying to preach conciliation in the country after all the bloodshed of the revolution. After they had executed most of the people he didn't like, then he's like, hey, we need to stop this fighting. um and this painting was greatly admired by Napoleon, who saw the potential in David to help secure his legacy because of his talent, and because he was such a well-known and prominent painter. And the work is the turn from the martyrdom of the previous works of Marat, of Socrates, even of the Haradi, to reconciliation. And instead of glorifying death for a cause, it focuses on the women who seek to stop the violence between their husbands and their fathers. And it represents the political healing. And this painting was greatly inspired by his wife and her. I'm sure when they divorced, she visited in prison. I'm sure she greatly wanted him to just let it go. You know, just
Hmm.
be like, okay, it's time for the bloodshed to stop. And so he used this painting as a kind of a it was obviously it was an appeal, but it was an appeal to the female sphere of society, where the females, the women had to come in and intervene to moderate the radicalness and the violence of the men. Um, where the women are
Completely
throwing them.
ignoring the Madame de Dufarge types, where it's like, oh yeah, no, let's click our
Yeah,
little needles and get the guillotine going.
yeah. Um, of course, and this is a legend, and he really keyed in on it, and it spoke to him. And there's a lot of really great elements in it. I'm not going to zoom in too much because there's quite a bit of nudity in it. Of course, there's no wiener, thankfully, but it being that it is so large, there is a lot of room for detail in it. Um, I think some of the coolest detail is in the background on this, on the kind of ramparts in the back where there are people fighting. You can see there's archers on the ramparts, and it's not just and it does look like there's a bit of battle going on back and forth there. And there's a shit ton of
I
other
think
details in here.
I
The
really
golden
like
cow.
the inclusion of the Roman wolf.
Yeah,
on the standard, and then I'm trying to figure out what the hay on the pike is representing, but that's a neat detail.
yeah, yeah. The Roman wolf with, of course, the for the Romulus and Remus, being nursed by the
Hmm.
wolf. And then the Roman standard, the Roma. Um, the horses are really cool. They're really interesting and well done. The wild eyes of the horses, which would be, I think, kind of reflected in the battle. Um,
Hmm.
and then, of course, the women bring their children out too, and they plead with their husbands. They're like, "Hey, um, stop, stop trying, just stop fighting. We're tired of the brother wars, so to speak."
Hmm.
So,
Just I just caught this. The prominent figure on the far bottom right, leading the horse away, he's wearing a Phrygian cap, which is a very prominent piece of symbology in Republican style revolutions, both in the American Revolution and in the French Revolution. It's just a little detail, kind of like an acknowledgement of his republicanism in the kind of
yeah,
I guess I would say just kind of like a hint as to his allegiances.
yeah, it makes perfect sense. That's a great detail to point out because I did not know that. That's fantastic. I love it. And it makes perfect sense. Um, he was an ardent believer of the Republican ideals of the Enlightenment. But as I said, of course, this painting drew the attention of Napoleon, which brings us to our next painting. The final painting we're going to talk about, and this is Napoleon at St. Bernard's Pass. It was painted between 1800 and 1801. And it's oil on canvas. It measures 102 by 87 inches or 259 by 221 centimeters. And this currently resides at the Chateau de Maison. Um, and 5 total versions of this were completed between 1801 and 1805. This is the original one.
Hmm.
So this is also known as Napoleon crossing the Alps, or Bonaparte crossing the Grand St. Bernard. And it depicts Napoleon crossing the St. Bernard's Pass in May of 1800. Napoleon instructed David to portray him as calm and mounted on a fiery steed. Um, and this is really his political theater and propaganda at its finest. He portrays Napoleon as a really heroic figure here, and it doesn't show a historical event as much as it shows, a vain emperor in a manner he wanted to be seen. Because the reality was, it was really just a normal crossing, and
Mm-hmm.
and during the crossing, Napoleon actually rode a fucking mule. He was riding a mule and just wearing a plain gray coat. Because of course, if you're crossing the Alps from France into northern Italy, it's cold. Why would you
Mm-hmm.
be all, you would just wear a gray pea coat to stay warm, whatever. Um, so the painting is a heroic depiction and has the names of Bonaparte, Hannibal, and uh, Carolus Mangus, who is Charlemagne, at the bottom. Uh,
What
and
that and the fact that he had this painted during his lifetime with those names of legend
Right,
tells you exactly who Napoleon was.
right, yeah, because Napoleon really wanted to, um, he really wanted to associate himself with legend. Of course, he was full of himself, and yeah, mules were far more practical than horses to get over passes like that. They often used um, mules to travel like that because, again, like they're just hardier animals than horses. Um, and this secured David's spot as the official court painter of the Napoleonic Empire. And so, with this painting, he stops painting virtue and starts painting destiny, because the real Alpine crossing, of course, like I said, was far less dramatic, but accuracy was not the point. He presents Napoleon as a man of irresistible force, calm in the face of chaos, ascending into history alongside Hannibal and Charlemagne. And it is one of the great acts of political image making in European art. Um, of course, because a lot of people have seen this. They've seen this painting. It's not an unfamiliar painting. In fact, a lot of his works are very popular with people who are not popular, but they're well known by people who don't know art, just because they're such commonly used images. The death of
Well,
Socrates. Go ahead.
Death of Marat. It
Mhm.
really is one of the most iconic images of Napoleon.
Really, it really is.
And this is before his defeat by the coalition.
Yeah,
This is Napoleon conquering the world,
yeah.
and it does come across. And I don't know how many books on Napoleon I've run across where some variation of this is on the cover. It's
Yeah,
pretty amazing.
yeah. I mean, it is a real iconic image, um, even if it's total bullshit.
Yeah.
It's total fantasy, and just political propaganda, of course. But it accomplishes what Napoleon wanted it to do. Um, and if Napoleon had known, actually he probably knew at the time like how iconic this image was, even though he was, full of himself. He probably recognized, and many people would have recognized how important this image would become throughout all of history
Mhm.
in tying Napoleon to, in securing Napoleon's legacy as a mythic figure.
And I will also say, just because there is a part of Napoleon that does absolutely deserve this level of iconic bullshit, because he simply was that big of a force sweeping across Europe, not just militarily but culturally. I mean,
Yeah,
that whole era of stability after a very turmoil filled revolution, and then to raise a nation such as France into one of the greatest threats that Europe had ever seen. I mean, you could even say the world had ever seen at that point, and inspired a world war essentially. This
yeah,
is seeing this painting. It's like, yeah, it's bullshit. It's a lie, but it's also a study of the impact that one man had across an entire continent, even a hemisphere,
yeah,
and that's just really cool.
yeah. And it was I mean, it was largely thanks to, I mean, he, of course, he did the military part, but the image making was entirely David. Um, a lot of the myth making was because of David. So and it shows how his transition from, the revolutionary painter to the empire painter, um, it's and his ability to adapt to that style, really speaks to his talent. So that's the last painting. So we'll go into the wrap up here. So talk about the fall of the empire. So David was made the Chevalier de Légion d'Honneur in 1803, and he was promoted to an officer in 1808, and then in 1815 he was promoted to commandant, now commandeur de la Légion d'Honneur. In 1815, the Napoleonic Empire fell, and the House of Bourbon was restored to power. The restored King Louis the Third or the 18th granted David amnesty and actually offered him a position as a court painter, despite his involvement in the execution of Louis XV. But uh, he was still firmly against the monarchy, so he refused, and he chose self-exile in Brussels. And during his time, he was considered the leading painter in France, and many considered him to be the leading painter in Western Europe. And he had dozens of
Hmm.
pupils, um, many of which went on to become famous painters themselves. And on December 29th in 1825, he was struck by a carriage while leaving a theater and later died as a result of his injuries. So he didn't die from old age or anything like that. He died in a friggin' car accident, basically, um, which
Huh.
is kind of interesting. But his body was disallowed to return to France due to his role in the regicide, and he was buried in Brussels. Um, and his body was moved to the National Cemetery in Brussels in 1882, although some claimed that his heart was actually taken and buried with his wife at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. So
Hmm.
just an amazing force of a human being and artist during his time. And yeah, it was that's that's what I got. Wrapped up a few minutes early. Went through it really quick. But he presided over presided over and painted and documented one of the most turbulent and bloody periods in France's history. Was associated with some of the most terrible and powerful individuals in all of history. Really a larger than life artist and just an outstanding, an amazing artist of the time, but still one of the most important artists of all time, in my opinion. So that's Jacques-Louis
Yeah.
David. Let's say next week we are going to be talking about Caspar David Friedrich. This would be a bit of a change of pace, although he was kind of contemporary to David in their lifetimes overlapped. They didn't intersect. They were and they're two very different types of painters. So next week we'll be talking about the more personalized art as we move into Romanticism and the romantic landscapes of Friedrich, away from the grandiose political and patriotic gestures of David's paintings. So I hope you all will be willing to join us next week for that. Again, on Thursday, same time. We're not going to change the time. We're going to keep it here. Do you have any closing thoughts, Bleach?
No, not really. I think this was another fascinating artist. I see the heavy influence of Caravaggio and the use of Chiaroscuro. So we seem to be touching on a constant theme of this style of art, which I think is honestly fascinating. That there's
Yeah,
that much influence from a few individuals that we see, but it also changes generationally to these fantastic art pieces to the point of, yes, the character styles change, but they keep going back to the certain old masters and relearning these skills generation after generation.
yeah, absolutely. There's echoes of the best artists echo throughout history, and their works resonate throughout multiple artists. And that's that's art history and legacy, but that's also our history and legacy as descendants of these people, descendants of the European tradition. And so with that, I think we can wrap it up. I'd like to thank everybody that came out. Kingdom of Vinland, it's good to see you. Fab Daddy stopped by, and LGM, and then VTT. You guys are all rock stars. I appreciate you coming out. And then on your channel, we got Formal Zeno. Thank you for for coming out as well. And yeah, love art, love yourself, and love your people.
Exactly. Reclaim it because your past is your future.
Absolutely. Bye, folks.
Cheers.